It's February 16th, 2023. This is Roqe. Well, hi there. Welcome to episode 239 of Roqe. There is no such thing as normal in the Islamic Republic of Iran. I'm Jian a Lodi from Toronto. Salam Dostan Aziz. Durud Bar Shama. There is no such thing as normal in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Recently, there's been talk, fueled by the regime itself, of course, and aided by media like the Financial Times, that Iran is somehow returning to normal after months of volatility. Let's set aside the fact that protests continue in all kinds of forms, and that there is a clear mass majority desire for regime change, and that the Islamic Republic is teetering on the precipice of collapse in every way, including economic disarray. The normalcy case seems to be that with a revolutionary fatigue setting in, Iranians inside Iran are back to their daily lives, going to shops, trying to stay employed, driving in the streets, whatever. And sure, let's concede that these daily rituals are continuing, in some cases as before, but let's not call things normal. There's no such thing as normal in the Islamic Republic. Oh, there is a continuity to repression and suppression and the continuance of what appears to be a functioning society at a surface level. But let's dispense with the term normal, because we must never normalize the antics and regulations of a regime that people despise. And so the news emerged today that a female teacher in the northern region of Mazandaran was fired for playing a love song in class and sharing the video of children singing along to it in social media. The song is a cheesy ditty that includes such shocking lyrics as, "I'll drink alcohol." It would hardly be noticeable as something provocative in almost any other context. And this female teacher is dutifully wearing her hijab in the video, not even singing herself. But for this outrageous crime of allowing her students some singing time, she's been sacked. Imagine being fired for playing a cute love song. That is not normal. Nor should it be. And the hardest part is that for Iranians listening to this right now, there will be absolutely no surprise that she lost her job. Hell, citizens of the Islamic Republic have been fired or detained or tortured or even executed for less. Let's not forget that this latest revolution was kickstarted when Mahsa Amini was killed for wearing her headscarf the wrong way. Let's not ever call this normal. It's not. It's not normal that a couple cannot dance in front of Azadi Tower in Tehran. It's not normal that you cannot attend a co-ed social event or gym in the 21st century. It's not normal that you cannot legally ride a bicycle if you're a woman. Of course, people do. They do all of these things defiantly, and sometimes they're caught, and sometimes they're not. But it's not normal that they're breaking the law by trying to have these basic freedoms. It's not normal that you cannot hold hands with your boyfriend in public. It's not normal that you cannot have a beer or any alcohol while watching a football game or any time. It's not normal that you cannot sing, play, or perform rock music. Hell, if you're a woman, you cannot sing or record publicly at all, unless it's in some gender-specific hall. A couple of months ago, when as part of our Voices from Inside Iran series, we were doing a phone interview with a young woman in Shiraz who'd bravely been on the front lines of demonstrations, I asked her what she most looked forward to in a future free Iran. I thought she might come back with some grand answer about democracy or human rights or freedoms. You know what she replied? I want to be able to walk my dog. It's not normal to not be able to walk your dog. There's no such thing as normal in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that's why so many of us cannot wait for this regime to be gone. Coming up on this new edition of Roqe, a feature-hour interview with the psychologist and academic Dr. Fathali Moghaddam on his new book, Political Plasticity, The Future of Democracy and Dictatorships, plus the Roqe Roundtable. This is Roqe, episode 239. Is democracy in Iran achievable? Here we are in the studio in Toronto, set to go with episode 239. Dr. Fathali M. Moghaddam, our only guest today. As he should be. He is.
Yes.
I'm so happy to have him back on the show. Such an interesting, provocative, thought-provoking academic and writer, the Iranian-British psychologist, author, professor of psychology, and the director of an interdisciplinary program in cognitive science at Georgetown University in D.C. He's just put out a new book called Political Plasticity, The Future of Democracy and Dictatorships. And I just finished the book a couple of days ago. And wow, I can't wait to get into this with him. I think I'm going to begin the interview by issuing a disclaimer, maybe not a disclaimer, but just warning people and him that not everybody's going to like what he has to say.
Yeah.
Well,
just from looking at the blurb and
Well, the book is great. It's amazing, and it's so. It's a deep dive into democracy and dictatorship and thousands of years of history. Right. So it's not something that we're going to be able to fully comprehensively address in a 1-hour interview. But the upshot of it is that democracy is tough. And that we tend to, what he means by political plasticity, he'll do it when we comes on the show, but he means whether the elasticity or the plasticity of politics, whether things can change in societies. And he argues that if you zoom out and over history, patterns replicate, and there is a continuity of behavior, particularly when it comes to authoritarianism and dictatorships. So it's very hard, for example, to have a revolution and completely transformatively change from a dictatorship like we currently have in Iran to a full actualized democracy. I'm not sure that he would call his book pessimistic, but I think some people would say it might be, because he's kind of, he's saying, here's the reality. The reality is there's all these things that happen, and how did they end up? How did the Russian Revolution, how did the Arab Spring end up? How did and he talks about the continuity of behavior. And we've talked about this a bit on the show too, is are Iranians capable, are we, as a, not because they're not smart, not because we don't want it, but as a collective, can Iranians do democracy? Because it hasn't existed. A liberal democracy in the way that Canada exists hasn't existed in Iran. So that's a new phenomenon, and depending on how entrenched the behavior is, how do you shake that up, right?
It's funny, as you were saying that, I was kind of thinking in my head, am I feeling optimistic hearing this, or am I feeling like I'm losing hope as I'm hearing this? Because on one hand, yes, it speaks to the struggle of reaching that point, but on the other hand, it's kind of giving me a sense of, okay, well, it is difficult, and maybe that's why it's taking a long time, and so
look at
two sides of the same coin.
When we say it's a marathon and not a sprint, sometimes we're superficially just referring to when the regime gets toppled. That's the first part.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
That's the first part. Then it's avoiding another Khomeini, another regime that's something that's distasteful, right? So listen, this is a very crude analysis or summary of his book. I wait for him. Don't listen to me right now. Wait for him to come on and explain this. But I am going to challenge him a little bit, because I'm not sure what, on a social, cultural, and maybe even political level, we know what a difference it's going to make getting rid of this regime. How do you not value freedom of expression for women, for LGBTQ people, for the just fundamental things that will change that in that opening essay there, walking your freaking dog.
Exactly.
So Dr. Fathali M. Moghaddam coming up. One of the stars of that Netflix series, How to Become a Tyrant. If you haven't seen that yet, fantastic series. Check it out. He's one of the people in that series. It's really, really worth seeing. How are you doing, Shaya?
Doing good.
Becca, you're doing well?
Doing good. Another day going through Twitter and whatnot. I spent a lot of time on Twitter the last 24 hours, I guess.
Oh, dear. My condolences.
Yeah, exactly. I got sucked into the Persian Twitter.
The Iran vortex?
Yeah, exactly.
And what did you get sucked into?
It just started with one video of the protests going on right now, and then it just kind of spiraled from there.
So this is a good thing, right? Are we energized by what's, as far as I can tell, I'll segue into the roundtable here. We'll do a short roundtable before we get to Dr. Moghaddam. But as far as I can tell, there's demonstrations. There have been demonstrations today in Tehran, in Iran, something to coincide with the 40th day anniversary of the executions.
That's right.
So is that what you've been
Yeah,
seeing?
that's exactly what I was referring to. So like you mentioned, it's the 40th day of passing of Mehdi Karami and Mohammad Hosseini, so two of the individuals who were executed. And the protests that we're referring to, they took place in Tehran, Isfahan, Izeh, Mashhad, Karaj, just to name a few of the different cities. And yeah, definitely energizing to see individuals.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
It's been a while since we've seen all kinds of defiance inside Iran, but since we've seen, other than in Zahedan or in Kurdistan, that kind of action in the streets that we saw in Tehran today.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we talked about it on the last episode, saying that following the 22 Bahman, we were going to see some of these protests. So it's nice to see that, we talked about it, we were anticipating it, and now we're seeing the videos from it. But the flip side to that is, of course, there's reports of tear gas being used and, brutality again. So that part of it is still heartbreaking for sure.
Anything more you want to say about the protest?
No, just videos of it coming out, and again, mixed feelings.
What's the mixed feeling part?
Well, I mean, like you said, it's energizing, but still, every time there's these protests, it's met with force.
That's to be expected. Yeah. There was something you were saying to me earlier. I don't want to out you on this, but I think it's also not not an out of context. It's germane to both the little essay that I just did and to having Dr. Moghaddam come on. You were saying one of the things you're concerned about, that we talked about early in the uprising, the revolution, is that I mean, it's one thing for the regime to signal that it's going to moderate, and we all go, this is bullshit, Nayaki, fuck you, whatever, we don't agree, this is PR. But it's another that when there is some moderation mixed with the exhaustion of the public in terms of wanting to keep up the revolution and everything, that there's a slide into acceptance on the inside Iran. That this is not me talking. This is am I paraphrasing? Am I explaining what you're worried about?
A little bit. I mean, I don't even know if I would call it a worry. It's just something that I noticed over the last couple of days, really. I have some friends on Instagram who have traveled to Iran recently, which in and of itself I was really shocked to see. But, I expected to see their stories and to see protests and to see, demonstrations out on the streets and,
Did you really?
Well, I did.
Did you really expect to see that?
I really thought, I mean, not
your
even...
Your friends going to visiting the north of Tehran or something?
Not that they were going to take part in it per se, but even just in passing, that there would be, some sort of a video or, some of the writings on the wall that we've seen shared in places like Persian Twitter and whatnot. But what I ended up seeing is actually quite the opposite. I've been seeing videos of, people in cafes and semi-concerts and coffee shops in the north of Tehran and things like that. And all you see is these images of, young women with no hijab, which is great, but it's a very different image than the protests. It's a very different story that these images are telling.
Well, what is your takeaway?
I don't know if I really have a takeaway. It's just what it made me think about is, I hope that we don't give in to just that. I hope that this fight continues and that, by having lax rules and regulations on the hijab, we don't... Isn't
it possible for brave women or folks in the north of Tehran to defiantly not wear a hijab and also to be wanting the revolution to continue?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think
it doesn't necessarily suggest that everyone's quiescent, given up.
Yeah, I don't think it's mutually exclusive for sure, but I think it was just the surprise of seeing those images after 5 months of seeing.
Okay. I mean, even in the heat of the protests, a cousin of mine went back to Iran because one of our family members had died, and came back and said, "No, there's pockets of." I mean, we've heard pockets of Tehran where you wouldn't even think anything's happening. So that's part and parcel of the. I don't believe that you thought your friends were going to come back with videos of like.
I definitely didn't think they were going there to partake in the heat of the action or anything like that.
But what did you expect them to see? We're not, we know that there isn't tons of action in the streets right now.
Yeah. But I think it was just the surprise. I think after 5 months of just seeing this on Twitter and being so focused on the revolution.
Well, that's what the regime says.
Yeah. I guess it
that
is.
says that we're seeing stuff from, Manitou and the American government, and we shouldn't believe anything.
Yeah.
So now you're echoing their
Oh God, no, never. I would never echo anything that the regime says. But I want to get Shaya's take on this because we briefly talked about it. And
stay out of it.
He
Shaya.
mentioned something.
I counsel you to not get involved in this.
Yeah, I think what I'm going to say is echoing like regime things. So I prefer to.
No,
stop.
what do you what?
No, actually, I asked Pega that how many of the people you follow actually they live inside Iran, and she said like 2%, 3%, and so for me as a person who like a lot of people that I'm following, they are inside Iran.
You don't have any friends outside of Iran.
Yeah,
as I
other
recall.
than you.
We just became friends on Instagram.
Right. No, please. Sorry. Go ahead.
So yeah, based on that, I mean, I'm not surprised by what Pega told, because I mean, people has to live, so they
yes,
they live.
Which doesn't make it normal. Doesn't make it a normal
and
country.
I don't have a problem with that.
Right.
It's just for me, it was just the element of surprise.
Of course, over a period of time, people have to.
I mean, that's a very good point. That even there is no normal there. People. That's a very good point on the essay. Yeah.
But do you think we have a normal here? I mean, we're starting to see, advertisements for all sorts of different Nowruz celebrations and things like that.
I thought you meant in Canada.
No, I'm not saying.
Well, there's more normalcy.
Yeah, I can walk a dog
people can
here.
Ride their bike. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean in the sense of Iranians living outside of Iran.
No, I think this is an ongoing, as we said spoke to Shirin Nasiri, who was here, about her take on Nowruz. I think this is an ongoing tug of war with ourselves, How much in what ways do we return to our old, patterns of behavior? And in what ways do we not feel comfortable with that? To a certain extent, it's everybody's their own choice.
Right.
But, I personally don't get the let's go back to partying every weekend, with our fancy galas thing. It doesn't totally work for me.
Yeah.
Don't begrudge anybody dressing up and, wanting to have a good time. But I think the pacing ourselves doesn't have to involve running in the direction of effusive, joyous celebration that we have to kind of... but everyone has spoken to the fact that I thought actually Shirin did a good job of it on Monday, kind of saying, look, I still dance for myself. I'm not going to dance on Instagram and do all of that, but I also believe that we should, for example, respect the Persian tradition of Nowruz and celebrate it and have a half scene and that type of thing. But this is where after 6 months, this is where we're going to be at, right? Almost 6 months. What did you think of? We talked a little bit about this just before I get to Dr. Moghaddam. This Munich conference, which is
the 7th
tomorrow. Tomorrow.
Yeah.
This is the one that now I see Reza Pahlavi, Masih Alinejad, and Nazanin Boniadi, amongst others, are attending.
That's right.
What's kind of, I don't know how significant this is in terms of, symbolically or practically, but seems to me this is one of the first institutional gatherings in the world, like the Munich, a global happening where there are representatives. I don't really actually know. I'm speaking without knowing. I don't know if they're official representatives or they're just going, but where there are representatives of Iran and Iranians that are not the regime.
Yes.
I mean, there's representatives on stages at demonstrations, and there's the meeting with Macron or Trudeau or whatever. But in terms of something that feels a little more official, is this not kind of a big deal?
It is. It's a very big deal. And I think it's exactly what you mentioned. It's that it was the first invitation to opposition figures or leaders, whichever word you want to use, for something.
Opposition humans.
Sure. Yeah. For them to attend a conference on an international stage, I guess. And the most important piece in this is that this conference typically they would extend an invite to the Islamic Republic, and this is the first time that they've actually not invited the Islamic Republic and instead invited opposition figures. So I think that's where, this is really a big deal, and I'm really looking forward to seeing, what's going to come of that tomorrow.
Yeah. All right. Anything else for the roundtable, Shai?
No.
Let's get to, do we have Dr. Moghaddam?
Yes.
All right. Before we get to him, I should mention that we now have our Patreon page set up. So if you would like to and can support, what are you doing? You're showing it to me?
Yeah, I'm showing you some of our patrons, actually. We've got some...
Oh, should I say their names?
Yeah, we can shout out some of our patrons now.
I want to... Well, yeah, I mean, we said we were going to do this. Here, just bring this a little closer.
Yeah, of course.
Let me see here. So you can go to our website now, roqemedia.com, and press the support us button. It'll take you to our Patreon page, where you can either be a bronze or a silver or a gold member on Patreon, and you get a little extra access, and you get some correspondence and some things from us depending on which category you are. Everyone's a winner, though. Yes. Everyone gets a small gift, no matter what. We do support the activities here at Roqe and the ongoing mission to build an audiovisual encyclopedia of Iranian diaspora identity via crowdsourcing, and this is really helpful to have Roqe members on our Patreon page. So thank you to, let me just, I'm going to do a couple of names each episode. I want to thank Ali Sharma. I actually know Ali Sharma has been a long time patron of the program. Farshad Naqibi, Sarah Swanson, the very Iranian name, Sarah Swanson. Appreciate her tuning in and being a sponsor. Thomas Kadlas, is that how you think we'd say that?
I think so.
Thomas Kadlas داریم Kadlas.
توماس خودمون.
Tom Cruise, Tom Cruise خودمون. Yeah. But is there anybody's name I was not supposed to say? That one. Okay, don't say that. And Kayvon Behram, who is a silver member. Yeah. Thank you, you guys. We super appreciate people becoming Roqe members on our Patreon page. Again, you just go to roqemedia.com, press the support us button, and you'll be hearing from us.
You can also find us on the Patreon website as well. If you're familiar with Patreon, you can just search Roqe Media, and you can find us that way as well.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, people can they only pay cash to be part of our Patreon membership, or can they, with their credit card, or can they barter things like pelts and fancy chais?
I don't know if we've gotten there yet. Yeah, not there yet. Right now,
because I'm up for that. If they want to send us peste,
definitely,
we can have
or lavash, please. Lavash. If anyone wants to send us some of that.
Thank you very much, Pega.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shaya. Let's get to our featured guest today. My featured guest today is an Iranian-British psychologist, author, professor of psychology, and the director of an interdisciplinary program in cognitive science at Georgetown University. You may be familiar, as I was saying, with Dr. Fathali M. Moghaddam from his memorable appearances in the Netflix series How to Become a Tyrant. Dr. Moghaddam was born in Iran. He moved to England with his family at the age of 8. He received his formal education in England and then returned to Iran before the revolution of 1979 to do academic work. He was researching in Tehran during the hostage-taking crisis and the early years of the Iran-Iraq War. In 1984, he moved back to the West. He kind of had to, and spent a period at McGill in Montreal, where he did research on cultural diversity before working at Georgetown University, which is where he is now. He has conducted experimental and field research in numerous cultural contexts and published extensively on radicalization, intergroup conflict, human rights, and the psychology of dictatorship and democracy, which is our focus today. His books include The Psychology of Dictatorship, Threat to Democracy, The Psychology of Democracy, Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychologist, and his latest book entitled Political Plasticity, The Future of Democracy and Dictatorship. This latest book is the focus of our interview today, on how continuity in dictatorships may be seen with the case of the current uprising in Iran, and of course the aspirations of Iranians for fundamental change to end this dictatorship. Right now, Dr. Fathali M. Moghaddam joins me from Washington, D.C. today. Hello, sir.
Hello, and I'm really delighted to be with you, and honored as well. I so much enjoy your talks and chats, and I'm wonderful to be back with you.
It's my honor, and I've just, as you know, I told you in a phone call earlier, I finished your book and this week, and really found it so interesting. Although I'll issue a disclaimer to the audience, if not to you, that I do worry that in this conversation, in this nuanced conversation, some of those out there in our audience who are particularly enthusiastic about a revolution in Iran right now, creating fundamental change, may be less than exhilarated by some of the things you have to say, or some of the realities as you see it. But I suppose that's not a surprise to you.
No, my research on what I call political plasticity, that is how fast, how much political change can take place and can't take place. I see it as realistic in the sense that we have to look at the situation critically and decide how can we change things, and where can we find possibilities where we look for long-term rather than short-term change. So it's a strategic approach using political plasticity as a guide.
Let me get you to drill down a little further on that definition so everybody's clear, because it's an interesting one. I think it's a term you've coined, political plasticity. Yeah. The point you seem to want to most underscore is that plasticity, or change when it comes to patterns of political and cultural behavior in society, is challenging. It's also rare. So give us this definition. What is it that you mean, if you can take a moment or two, by political plasticity?
Absolutely. Well, I think we've all heard of brain plasticity, and the mainstream orthodox research focuses on the brain and plasticity in the brain. What I'm pointing out is that the world outside us is also a huge constraint on how we can change. It's not just hardwiring within the brain, it's hardwiring outside the brain. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me give you a simple example. One of the chapters in my book on political plasticity asks, why do we still have leaders? If we look back over the last 10, 12,000 years of settlements in human societies, we've been led by leaders who typically are older males, and they make the critical decisions, for example, on whether we go to war or not. Think about the last few decades where someone like George W. Bush, Tony Blair, they made the critical decision to invade Afghanistan, invade Iraq, both disasters from my perspective. But who could stop them? Who could stop them? We have this tradition, and what I'm saying is, this is a long-term tradition. After the revolution in the United States, we still have not had a woman in the White House. So that's what I mean by limited political plasticity.
Right. Even though the book is called Political Plasticity, your actual point is that political plasticity is rare or limited or difficult.
Not always. Not always. There are examples in the book of where political plasticity is high. Let me give you an example. Think of the ways in which people's attitudes towards gays has changed over the last few decades, how rapid that has been. Think of the ways in which women have broken through in education. I'm so excited by that, and I see the future of Iran in women's hands. That is the future. That is where political plasticity is high.
Let me come back to that. That's how you end your book, and that's an affirmative note that I want to come back to. In terms of continuity of behavior, which you spend a fair bit of time on in this book, and it's so interesting for me. You start your book with this anecdote about being in Iran in 1977. You're visiting family when you were a student in London, as I said in the introduction, and you find yourself in a gorgeous new Italian-designed opulent home in Tehran that suggests the economic future is bright in Tehran, that Iran is full of modernism. And then you visit your great-grandfather in an older part of town, and you find yourself in a house that is devoid of any Western influence or furniture and is extremely traditional. It's old-school Persian, if you will. But it is what you discover about behavior in those two very different houses that is your takeaway. Can you explain for us?
Yes, absolutely. So in the modern house, you have a Italian setting, Italian furniture, Italian fashion, etc. In my great-grandfather's house, there are no chairs. We sit on the floor. We eat watermelons. There are no telephones. Nothing at all modern. However, on the surface, these look different. At a deeper level, our behavior in the context is very similar. For example, in each context, there is a bala, the top of the room, and pain, the bottom of the room. And those who have high status sit bala, sit at the top. I, as a mass student, youngster coming in, I sit next to the door, right at the bottom. When I sit down, I don't allow the soles of my feet to show to others. I tuck them in. Whenever a high status person comes in, everybody stands up. And that is true for whether you're in the westernized Iranian house or whether you're in my great-grandfather's house. So what I'm pointing out is the furniture, the surface things look different, but when you look at actual behavior, the deeper norms that guide behavior are the same. And then I point out that before and after the revolution, we had very different dictators. We had the Shah, westernized, skier, multilingual, eloquent in many things. And we had Khomeini, Eastern, wearing very traditional clothes, his wife with hijab. Now, on the surface, they look completely different. But underneath that, there is continuity in that you have a single male dictating to everybody else.
Right. I'm going to come back to that particular point because I think there are people who would take issue with whataboutism with the Shah and the current regime because for many reasons, but particularly in this moment. But let me come back to that because that's a rich part of the conversation. On this point where you're talking about continuity of behavior, to use a non-Iranian example, you use, which I think is quite compelling, you use racism in America as an example of the limits of political plasticity. Tell us why the plight of African Americans in the United States today is instructive.
Absolutely. If you look at the history of ethnic relations in the United States, we start with slavery and then the banning of slavery. We have the Civil War. And if we look at the logical level of analysis where everything is formal, it looks as if we should be in a completely different world right now. But actually, underneath that, the subjugation of the African Americans has continued. There's a new form of slavery. And that is what is continuous. That's what I call low political plasticity.
So why, just on this point, I mean, you come at this from a psychological perspective. Why in some cases is this dictum that if you change the laws from above, things will change? You use the example of the LGBTQ community. Once same-sex marriage laws were changed in the United States, it seems like attitudes changed as well. Why, in that case, is the population psychologically progressing, but not in the case of the plight of African Americans?
That's a great question. I think My answer is that it's the strategy used by the minority. That's the key. Let me give you the example of women. At my university, women were excluded. They couldn't do most of the programs until recently. Most universities were like that. Women were just excluded. When I joined my department, the vast majority of faculty were men. There were very few females. Now it's reversed. Most the faculty are female. The top programs like our PhD program is predominantly female. How has this come about? I think it came about because women stood up and said, we can compete with men directly. Just give us the chance to compete and we will do it. And they did it. They did not say, we are different. We want a different approach to this. They did not celebrate differences. They celebrate uniformity. And I think that strategic difference is key. In other publications, I have argued for what I call omniculturalism, which emphasizes human commonalities, against the celebration of differences and the highlighting of differences all the time. I think minorities are better served when they do what women have done and with what gays have done, to compete directly and to say we want to be part of the mainstream. That's the key.
That's interesting stuff. I mean, if we zoom out, and it's rather than using those sort of identity politics, you cited a moment ago, you were talking about the 1979 Iranian Revolution. We have newer examples, more contemporary examples of revolutions or attempted revolutions that have taken place. One of the things that you talk about to suggest that fundamental change has not come, despite what would seem to be significant shifts in the politics of nations, is the Arab Spring. Tell us what we learned from the Arab Spring that took place 13, 14 years ago.
The Arab Spring, I see it as a second wave at the moment. We haven't finished yet, but the unfortunate thing about the Arab Spring was really the leadership, where extremists took over and tried to do too much, and then they were shut down, and then we had a return to dictatorship. For example, in Egypt. In Egypt, the Islamic Brotherhood came in, immediately tried to implement extremist policies. Women and other groups immediately realized the danger, and they came back to dictatorship under the military. So in the Arab Spring countries, we've had this tragic overstepping by the leadership. And this was a missed series of opportunities. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that political plasticity is not just about how much the population can change and how quickly. It's also about leadership. What kind of changes can the leadership bring about in their relationship with the population? In Iran, our biggest tragedy was that we had Khomeini and not Mandela after the revolution. See, Mandela is one of those rare individuals in history, like George Washington, who, when they were handed power and given the opportunity to stay in power, said no. They said, I have my turn, then somebody else. We had the unfortunate experience of having Khomeini and now Khamenei, who are both absolute dictators and refuse to give up power. They will only give up power when they die. So this is a critical part of political plasticity. To what extent does the leader allow change?
But what is happening psychologically that limits political plasticity, a limitation amongst people, the population, that you make the case that shapes the possibility of change towards a more open and democratic society. What is happening with us psychologically? Is it that we get so used to a certain type of structure that even though we will it to be different or want it to be different, we can't actually do that?
Yes, exactly. There are two sets of factors. One is the social skills we have. For example, here you and I are exchanging ideas. Just the free exchange of ideas requires social skills and a context to develop those social skills. That's one thing. Second thing is a set of cognitive capabilities, and those cognitive capabilities have to allow for tolerance for ambiguity, seeing the world as complex, as interrelated, not thinking categorically. Categorical thinking is black and white thinking. This is good, this is bad. This is right, this is wrong. That kind of categorical thinking is common to populations in dictatorships because they've been taught to think that way. There are a number of psychological characteristics that are important. One of them is authoritarianism. In dictatorships, authoritarian personalities are supported, and they support the authoritarian leader. At the moment, Khamenei's main support is from authoritarian males who hate the idea of, for example, liberated women, educated women.
Yes.
So there are a number of psychological factors we can identify here.
Let me try and use the case of Iran in particular in this current moment to test some of the ideas that you put forth in this book around political plasticity. You talk about how studies show that when people feel like their group identity is under threat, they tend to be more supportive of authoritarian strongmen as leaders, less supportive of human rights and democracy. And obviously this can be used to explain, for example, how Khomeini consolidated national support by using the Iran-Iraq war to suggest citizens were under threat and needed to unite behind him. How might people feel like their group identity is under threat after a revolution this time, were this regime to be toppled, with the premise of the toppling being that we want to get rid of mullahs who've shown a disdain for democracy and dissent? What is going to be the threat to this group identity that would enable an authoritarian personality to then take over after that?
That's an excellent question. After every revolution, the general trend of revolutions is that initially moderates come to power. For example, after 1979, you had Bazargan and a number of other relatively moderates. I mean, from my perspective, Bazargan was not actually a moderate, but he's relative to Khomeini, he was a moderate.
For a few months, sure.
Yes. And then so you have these moderates coming into power. It happens again and again, French Revolution, Russian Revolution. Then a number of events happen that lead the moderates to be weakened. And then you have a radical revolutionary leader like Lenin, like Mao, like Khomeini, like others, Cuban situation, jumping ahead and taking power. They grab power. Now, that radical revolutionary leader often uses external and internal threats to galvanize support from authoritarians within his society. And it's usually he. It's not a woman dictator. And this radical revolutionary leader uses threats. Now, what kinds of threats could come up after the next revolution? Well, the threat of invasion is always there. The threat of invasion, the threat of disunity. For example, the idea that the Kurds want to break up the country, the Baluchis are rebels. You see, these threats work to limit people's support for human rights. Another one I can see being tried is the threat of liberated women, because we know that in Iran there is a substantial group of authoritarian males, typically low in education, who are threatened by liberated women and educated women, and this will be used by the opponents of the next revolution. There's no doubt. They will galvanize authoritarian males.
This is the point of the revolution. It's called Women, Life, Freedom. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely. It's the point of the revolution, but we can predict what will be the opposition and where their base will come from.
And then somebody would use that opposition to say, to proclaim a kind of an authoritarian leadership to say where our new revolution is under threat.
Well, that could happen, or it could be that the opponents of revolution will use that in a Machiavellian way to weaken the society.
Right. Another thing that in the contemporary context of Iran and this uprising that is interesting, that you talk about in the book is that you don't necessarily talk about this moment in Iran, but I want to ask you about it. Is you talk about the hardwiring of individuals. And this is, I guess you're talking about continuity of behavior that we see as hardwired, no matter what is happening, no matter what is happening, as you would say, on the surface level, politically or in nation states over a period of time. How does this theory of hardwiring of individuals, i.e., to put it simply, individuals not changing their behavior, intersect with the current youth of Iran? Because would they not be, as I'm reading this in your book, I'm thinking, aren't the current youth of Iran an example of the opposite of hardwiring? That is that despite being born into the Islamic Republic, even despite their own parents, in some cases, they are rejecting what is their expected behavior, and deference to this theocratic state, and pushing for everything from women's rights to fair votes to collectivism. So where do we locate them in this hardwired spectrum?
In any discussion about behavior, we're talking about a spectrum. Not everybody behaves the same way. And the youth of Iran have been impacted by global trends through the internet. So they are a very special case. And I see them as having more dynamic, less rigid ways of thinking. And I see them as being less influenced by traditional Iranian leader-follower relationships. One of the challenges in Iran has been that when we grew up in families, we learned our relationship with the leader through the family. And that was part of what I call the external hardwiring that remained intact, so that inevitably in that context, you had somebody like Khamenei having a really high probability of becoming a strong dictator because he had that rigid pattern of behavior learnt in the population. But the youth of Iran are the hope, and women in particular are the hope, because they are breaking this pattern.
So it is possible to break the hardwiring.
Yes, it's definitely possible. And women are leading the way and showing how to do it. What I'm pointing out are the limitations. For example, in one chapter, I talk about the built environment. What do I mean by that? Well, the housing, the planning, the city, that is very slow to change. Let me give you an example. After the 1917 revolution, when the Bolsheviks, who were a minority, like the Khomeini crowd, they were a minority who grabbed power through force. They killed more people than anybody else. And they grabbed force. They grabbed power. Now, they wanted to change the family structure. What was stopping them? One of the things that was stopping them was architecture. The size of houses, the way housing was built. So they would shove hundreds of people in the same building and organize the apartments in different ways to try to change behavior. But they couldn't rebuild the city fast enough. The changes they wanted in the family never materialized.
When I said earlier that some people are going to find this deflating, I want to come at different ways of bringing this to you or asking you about it or even challenging you on it. It's because it seems like the democracy, the freedom movement for Iran currently is not just potentially swimming upstream in terms of toppling this extremely barbaric, iron-fisted regime, but swimming upstream in terms of the trends in our world. And you talk about when it comes to undemocratic leadership models and continuity, not only have we, on a global scale, not done a great job as humans of building collectivist societies that reflect collective democratic leaderships, we've done quite the opposite. The 21st century has no shortage of strongmen, as you point out. So we look at China right now with Xi Jinping, India with Modi, Russia with Putin, Turkey with Erdogan, and depending on who you ask, you can throw in all kinds of other countries in there, Venezuela, Hungary, North Korea, many others. And we can see many of those tendencies even in so-called democratic countries with popularly elected leaders as well. So what does that tell us, he asks, fearful of the answer, about the chances of Iran achieving a democratic leadership, even if we overthrow this current despotic regime?
I am very, very hopeful, but my hope is based on the idea that we must have knowledge first. Knowledge will give us power. And the knowledge I'm presenting is this picture of long-term change with a focus on things like leadership. We have to understand what leadership has involved, and by understanding it, we can change it. We have to understand the road to democracy that has been lengthy from Athens 2,500 years ago, and we have to understand the changes that have taken place and what the limitations have been and how we can overcome those limitations. Let me give you another example. When I give talks on psychology of democracy and dictatorship, Americans often challenge me and say, well, you're not giving enough credit to the American Revolution. Okay, let's give credit to the American Revolution. The Constitution of the United States gave the vote to free men, not to slaves, not to women. And the Americans say, well, this is a breakthrough at least. Well, I point out that 2,500 years ago in Athens, free men, not women, not slaves, had the vote. After that, the Roman Republic actually had, I think, a good representation in the Senate. Look, there have been different types of exercises in democracies over the last at least 2,500 years. We have to understand where the changes came, be realistic about how they came, and then build on that. So that's where I'm hopeful. That's where I'm hopeful. But of course, when you have a revolution, it is based on hope and aspiration. And people often, when I give a talk on political plasticity, they say, well, wait a minute, that seems pessimistic.
Well, on the face of it, it is pessimistic. I mean, yeah, no, have you been to any demonstrations recently? I mean,
right.
people are desperately hoping for a democratic future in Iran, or free Iran, as we say. And for example, I mean, other places in the world too, but for in terms of the Iranian community, and hearing that, well, if you go back thousands of years in history, the chances are pretty dim, buddy. That's a tough pill to take, right?
No, I think it's very optimistic in the sense that we have made progress across history. Again, I would go back to the situation of women. Look at the situation of women compared to even 100 years ago. Look at the rights they have achieved. Look at the improvements in their lives.
Okay, well, that's a good point. So how far are we supposed to take the notion of continuity and limits of political plasticity? Because surely we can see that, say, social or cultural or, I don't know, practical plasticity can be achieved in short term, right? When it comes to toppling the current regime in Iran. Would not the ability of women to have dominion over how they wish to dress, and the ability of young people to sing rock songs and dance and drink and express political dissent without being executed represent fundamental change? I mean, it's not quite a simple proposition then that getting rid of this current regime could not achieve those goals.
No, I agree with you. It will achieve those goals because this regime is so atrocious, so tyrannical, that you don't have to move much to get an improvement. All you have to do is give women equal rights by law, and you will transform Iran. Iran will be transformed as soon as women have equal rights.
So that is plasticity, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
So in some areas, I'm saying plasticity will come quickly.
Okay. And well, then let me bring back then how do we judge continuity? Because when you said earlier, we went from the Shah's period into the Khomeini era, and there was continuity of authoritarianism, and with all due respect to many people who've come on this show and talked about the imperfections of the Pahlavi era and all of the crackdowns on dissent and lack of democracy, etc. But I think if you polled the Iranian community globally right now and said, if you could snap your fingers and choose 1978, pre-Islamic Revolution or today, people would not consider those the same thing and would happily gravitate towards the late 70s before the revolution. So how do we see that as continuity?
Well, I see it as continuity in the sense that from my analysis, the Pahlavi era led to this era. We would not have been in this era if it had not been for the Pahlavis. In fact, if you look at the factual analysis of religion in Iran, it was the Pahlavis who supported the Muslim churches, the mosques. They extended the network of the mullahs. They did all of that because they thought, advised by the CIA, that the main threat to their rule was from the Marxists. They thought, we will use Islam to hammer the Marxists, ruin the left, and we will rule.
The conditions were enabled for a Khomeini-type regime to sweep in.
In his brilliant book on the Shah, Dr. Milani gives statistics on how many mosques were built during the Pahlavi era. He shows how they expanded the mosque system. I've discussed it in my work. So from my perspective, there is continuity because the Pahlavis led to the Islamic Republic.
Let me ask you about leadership then, because it's something that you've mentioned a few times. There's been an ongoing debate in the Iranian community in the last 2 or 3 months about how much we should be focusing on identifying who the current leaders of the opposition to this Islamic Republic regime are, especially in the diaspora, and how much time and energy we should be putting into deciding who represents us. Where do you stand on these kinds of debates before the current regime has been dethroned, if it's going to happen? Do you think they're helpful and proactive or unhelpful?
I think they're very helpful if we make sure we push women forward as leaders. We've got to have a situation where if there are 20 people in the leadership vicinity, at least half of them are women. And that I see to be critical, not just as this phase, but when this regime falls, and I hope it falls sooner, there must be women in the leadership at the national level. And I would love to see the first prime minister, the first president to be a female. That's the way we've got to go. And that I see there are so many highly capable women who could do this. And that's the breakthrough we need to make.
You end your book talking about how women are the future, and I'm going to end this interview asking you about that. Before we get there, what role might new technology play in challenging the limits of political plasticity to an extent? I know you've argued that the existence of new media alone has not necessarily changed things in and of itself. You cite the example of Donald Trump, an authoritarian leader, many would say, harnessing Twitter and social media tools that were meant to make us more democratic. In his case, they were harnessed to win power. But the facility, Dr. Moghaddam, of societal communication is having a different effect as well, where members of the citizenry have access to each other in ways that they never have before. And so in recent months, you've had Iranians, for example, telling each other not to share the current regime's propaganda, having some success in crowdsourcing, holding each other to account. Do you believe there is something there that can undermine those traditional limits to plasticity, as you call them?
Yes, I believe you're right. Technology can play a very important role in changing the level of political plasticity. But technology is not neutral. It is from us that it gets its direction, and we have to give it direction. And technology has already played a very important role in mobilizing young people in Iran. That's got to continue. And of course, we've got to use technology to change our relationship with the leadership and to push women forward, to give women more opportunities to come forward. We have tremendous talent among Iranian women inside and outside Iran. That is going to be the transformation in Iranian society, where leadership comes from women. That'll transform us.
It could transform the world. It could certainly transform the region, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things we have to overcome is this rigidity in our relationship with leadership. As I point out in the book, 10, 12,000 years of settlements, and almost all of that time, it's been male leaders, older male leaders. We've got to change that. That is going to change our relationships with one another and with the leadership.
Okay, I have $1 million question for you. You ready? At one point in your book, you make the case that we can often be victims of what you call bad advice, that we too naively eat up this kind of advice, especially when we're in a revolutionary context or a time of change. And you cite the example of being told Khomeini, for example, would retire. If he returned to Iran in the late 1970s, he wouldn't even be interested in a role in politics. He, of course, said these kinds of things. And you talk about how dictators can emerge when the conditions are present for such emergence, springboards. How do we, Dr. Moghaddam, mitigate or guard against that in the current context? How do we know if certain de facto leaders in the current opposition to the regime, men or women, would keep their words in terms of the language they're speaking today, the openness, the democracy, the unity, or would turn into the very dictators that we're trying to oppose if they were given the opportunity?
I think the way to do it is to be inclusive and as open as possible in leadership in the first phase. You remember I mentioned that in the first phase of revolutions, typically moderates come to power, and then emergencies arise, wars are created, crisis incidents are created so that a dictator can take over. This is what Khomeini did with the hostage taking, with the Iran-Iraq war. What we've got to do is have that inclusive group of leaders with lots of women included in that first phase, and then lock that in to prevent the next phase of typically of revolutions, where the extremist leader jumps to power.
What does it mean? Lock that in. What does that mean?
Lock that in the sense of the law. The law has to be changed. Obviously, the constitution needs changing. Velayat Faqih has to go first. You see, the constitution has to immediately be changed and locked in. And that has to be guarded by everybody. So that's the key. The most dangerous phase of a revolution is not the regime change phase. It is the phase when moderates have come in, then there's usually rising expectations and chaos, like 79 in Iran. The moderates were in, there was chaos and rising expectations. People wanted so much. And then Khomeini used crisis incidents. He used the hostage taking, he used the Iran-Iraq war, which he refused to end. It could have ended after the second year. He refused to end it.
Because it was benefiting him, yes.
Absolutely. So we have to be guarding against that phase of the revolution.
So you have to kind of prevent the oxygen being in the room for there to be so much volatility that somebody can take advantage of that and co-opt the revolution. That's a tough thing to plan for when you don't know exactly how the chips are going to fall in overturning
you can plan for it. You can plan for it because revolutions and what happens after them are fairly predictable. And you can predict that within the first year of the moderates, of the less extreme groups coming in, within the first year, there will be attempts to take over by extremists. You can predict that. You've got to change the constitution very quickly, not spend a long time on that, and you've got to lock in the safeguards very quickly. And of course, you've got to manage expectations. After revolutions, people have very high expectations that leads to relative deprivation and more efforts to change the regime. These are all fairly predictable from a psychological perspective.
Let me ask you about something that you don't specifically cite in the book. The book's not just about Iran in this moment, so it's not a surprise. But that would seem to me to be something that would limit political plasticity in the future of Iran and the chances of an open and democratic and free Iran. And that is something that you're probably familiar with, both as a psychologist and as an Iranian. That is that we mistrust each other, or that there's trust issues that come from the trauma of recent decades or even further back, and that this seems to be a big hurdle for our global community right now, grappling with the intention or the understanding that we need to be unified, and yet the knee-jerk sort of disunity that comes from attacking each other or not liking this leader or this representative or bringing up past ideologies or issues. How important will that unity be to sort of prosecuting this revolution and for a free Iran, and how much of a challenge is it for our community?
I would make 3 points. One is that the evil regime in Tehran is actively trying to sow mistrust among Iranians. That's its job. That's what it's doing. Second is that, yes, we need to develop more trust, and that comes through leadership. But a third point I would make is that Iranians have to put this in the global context. If you look at surveys, international surveys, trust is lower, not just among Iranians. In all major societies, people have less trust of institutions, of politicians, of one another. So trust has declined in the world. It's not just Iranians. And that's a separate debate about why trust has declined.
We've had a couple of psychologists or therapists who've come on the program in recent months and said that they believe, no matter the outcome, obviously they want the outcome to be affirmative in terms of a free Iran, but that they believe that this past few months for the global Iranian community, through all the ups and downs, has been like a collective healing or catharsis, or like one big freaking therapy session for a global community. Would you see it that way as a psychologist, or do you think that's maybe overstating things?
I'm not a therapist. I always tell people I don't do anything useful. I just do research and publish and teach. So I wouldn't want to tread in that area, because you've had experts in therapy talk about that. What I can say is, in terms of the cognitive and political processes, there has been more unity in opposition to this regime, and that can bring benefits to people individually and collectively. So I see more unity in opposition to this regime, and that is always a good thing.
All right, let's end where we started. And you said that the hope that resides for you with the current situation in Iran, and the hope that you end your book with, and the hope that I said I wanted to end the interview with, is with women and women leading the way. And it's interesting that you wrote this book, and that the end of your book is about how you believe the future is in women, and this revolution that's taking place in Iran has in fact been started and led by women, supported by men, of course, and youth at the forefront. You believe women are the most important key to progress towards expanding political plasticity and moving towards actualized democracy. So not just in the context of Iran, but globally. Tell us what you mean.
Yes, I think globally we're going to be moving towards what I call actualized or fully developed democracy if and when we allow women to come in and to take up leadership positions in a much more effective way than we have been doing. I think one of the shortcomings in the United States is that we have not allowed women to come through at the presidential level. The attempts that have been made by women attached to males like Hillary Clinton. I don't think that's a very useful way to do it. We need women who are competent, independent, and representative of the rest of society. So why do I think the advancement of women is going to solve many problems? First of all, I focus on things like overpopulation and global warming. When you have women coming into higher education and the workforce, you have less problems of overpopulation. Population control is necessarily going to be solved. When you have women in positions of political power, we know from research that they give more importance to health, education, welfare, these issues. So I'm pushing this line because I think it would be beneficial not just for Iran, but for all of the world. We need more representation, and families will also become more balanced. When you have more balanced families, you have more balanced children, healthier children. One of the problems with the Iranian regime right now is family law. Women have no power in families. And this is highly destructive because it creates a context where children are brought up in very, very destructive situations, psychologically destructive. So I think family law, parity for women, these will all lead to healthier societies, not just for Iran, but for the globe.
It's so good having you on. Let me ask you a final question, a personal question. The last time we had you on, it was actually before this uprising. It was a year and a half ago. I don't know. And you talked a little bit about your personal story of your frustration and the hurt at having to leave Iran after the 1979 revolution, when you couldn't do the kind of work that you wanted to do and have the kind of freedom you wanted. What has it been like for you as the person who writes about democracy and dictatorships, observing the last 6 months in the context of Iran?
It's been highly inspiring. I've really been inspired by the youth of Iran, the challenges they have taken up, and I have been humbled, really humbled, thinking how little I've done compared to them. So that's my personal reaction, and I'm really proud of what has happened. And I'm also at the same time just horrified by the evil of this regime. There's no doubt that compared to the Pahlavi regime, this regime is much more evil. It is a truly horrific, evil regime. So when I see continuity in Iran, I'm not saying this regime is the same as the last one. What I'm saying is we do see continuity, but this is a terrible, terrible regime that has to be overthrown. And I'm really inspired by young people leading the way to that regime change.
Thank you for the taking the time. It's always an inspired conversation, a spirited conversation having you on. I'm sure we'll get all kinds of reaction and there's so many points in this chat that have been provocative and interesting for our audience to respond to. So I'm grateful. I'm grateful to you for the time and for the education.
It's my pleasure and honor. Thank you very much.
Hope to see you again. Merci. Khudafis.
Khudafis.
Dr. Fathali M. Moghaddam, the psychologist, the academic, the author, the professor. Again, his new book is entitled Political Plasticity. He joined us from Washington, D.C. If you have any comments on that interview, or you want to agree, disagree, ask questions about the book, make any comments, you can do so on any of our platforms, of course, or you can email us at info@roqemedia.com. That's still also a possibility for feedback. Thank you to Dr. Moghaddam, and thank you to the amazing team who put this show together. This is full-time for Roqe for today. Savvy Roham, talented Anahita, Parisa Pega, Mehrtad Shaya, and the new Negin, who has been auditing the show today and potentially will be joining our team. We'll tell you more about her in the coming days. Thank you to all of you out there supporting us and sharing our content. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already on any or all of our platforms. You can find me on Instagram at Jian Gomeshi. You can become a Roqe member on Patreon by going to our website, roqemedia.com, and following the Support Us link. In the meantime, as ever, Mizun Bashi.